Hey everyone, it's Andrew Nagel with Valkenine Designs, and I am back with part 6 of the start to finish complex pendant design. Here we're going to finish off setting the opal in the top and finish off those top details. As you can remember, we have one length of the 21G square that is kind of bent up near the top. Our opal sits in there very nicely where we've kind of built a setting already with those other swirls and the tech detailing. What we're going to do is build a spiral weave detail and then a couple of more swirls onto the side of this opal. To start that off, we're going to use a couple of lengths of 21G square. We're going to feed those through our larger swirl here. We're going to attach them to the back, and once you have them nice and secure to the frame, then you're ready to start making your swirls. Attach those to any point on the frame, whatever is convenient for you. Once you have it tied down to the back, naturally bend that wire into a swirl. I say this all the time. A natural swirl looks better than a forced swirl. Same with a natural curve, and same with a natural line. Once you've formed your first swirl, you can then take your second length of wire. I'm using 21G square. You can use round. I prefer square because I feel like it's more rigid than the round wire. You're going to feed that second length through that first swirl that you've built and attach it to the back. Once you've attached it, you're ready to build that inner swirl. You're just going to naturally curve it along the first swirl that we've built. And then once it's shaped up right and looking how you want it to look, you can start to feed your 30 gauge through to the back frame and then start your spiral weave detail. I'm going to open up my swirl a little bit there, feeding my 30 gauge to the back. And then I'm going to start wrapping that around the outermost wire and then over to the innermost. I'm going twice around both of these the first time, and then I'm going to go twice around again on that outermost wire, twice on the innermost, and then I'm going to start my progression. And so here I'm going to go 3 times on the outermost swirl and then 2 times on the innermost, and then I'm going to wrap it 4 times around the outermost, and then 2 times on the innermost, and then a progression of up to 5 on the outermost, and then down to 2 on the innermost. Basically what you're doing is you're wrapping more times around the longer length of the swirl. And so the outermost wire has more surface area to cover, so we have to wrap the 30 gauge more times around that to make a longer wave on that side, so that way it fans open and creates our spiral weave detail. That's why we're remaining on 2 on the innermost swirl, because there's less length there. If you go the same length around, it'll just look like an even kind of X-weave pattern, and you ultimately won't be able to cover the innermost swirl. Well, you'll have too much 30 gauge wire on the innermost swirl, and you won't have a nice fan opening on the outermost swirl. So once I go up from the 4 to the 5 to the 6 to 7 on the outermost swirl, I'm just building up that progression until I get to the point where we're ready to set the opal into the pendant. Now at this section, I'm going to clip off my 30G round, and I'm going to start to feed it through and wrap it around the length of the 13 gauge half round. I saw a convenient spot here. It was just a nice little opening between the weave that I had done on the outermost swirl and detailing that we had done in one of the prior videos. If you have this opening, great. If you don't need to worry about it. I just saw the opening here, and I thought it would be a great opportunity to secure this wire to the next one to just create more stability throughout the whole piece. And so I'm wrapping it twice around that 13 gauge, and then I'm progressing with my spiral weave detail, and then as I've added a little bit more of the 30 gauge on that outermost wire, I'm then wrapping it again twice around that larger piece of 13 gauge half round that we used for the base swirl of this spiral weave detail. We did that in one of the earlier videos, so make sure you watch the progression of these videos up until this point. So I'm wrapping that 30 gauge through that little space. This is kind of like a finer weaving technique here. If you're able to get it through, great. If not, don't stress yourself out, and definitely don't try to bend your wires to make a point. You don't have to get it attached here. Just, you know, I'm only doing it just for a little bit more stability. It's not needed, but I just preferred to do it. So then we're going to progress up with that spiral weave detail until it's at the point where we're ready to set the stone into the frame. My spiral weave detail is progressed to where I want it. I have now clipped off the extra end of the innermost wire and fed it through to the back of the frame in a little bit of an opening that I saw down here at the bottom of the opal setting. Once you've pushed that wire down through, you saw how I was kind of inching it down there with the pliers. You don't want to force it through, and you don't want to pull it through the back because you might mess up your weave, as I kind of did mess up my weave a little bit. But that's okay. I'm going to add another little spiral detail in there, so it'll be all right ultimately. I'm going to pop that opal into the setting. It looks like it's sitting there very nicely, and especially once everything's all tied together, it will be in there pretty darn secure. And so once I've attached the points to the back, I'm just deciding which way I want to set that opal in there. I like to set it with the flashiest side facing up, or, you know, whatever it looks best at. That's how I like to set the stone, so that way when the client receives it, the flash is the best as it possibly can be. So I'm going to just do a little bit of an adjustment on my innermost spiral there using these round nose pliers. These are great for minute adjustments. So long as you capture the wire right, they don't leave really bad tool marks, and it's a lot easier to buff out. Once I get that weave detail how I want it to sit, I'm ready to progress on to the next bit of detailing, which is going to be the spiral that we're going to add closer to the top of the stone. We're going to do another spiral weave detail, and so we're building the outermost spiral with a length of 21 gauge square. I fed it through that spiral weave detail we just built near the top, and this will ultimately cover those longer endpoints that I just kind of messed up as I was feeding my innermost wire through to the back. I'm going to use a length of 22 gauge round to build the innermost detailing. And so once you've gotten your spiral adjusted how you want it to, you're ready to push through your other length of wire and start the construction of this next layered spiral weave detail. That's one thing I like about these X weaves, is they leave you a little bit of an opening, so that way you can feed a wire through and then, you know, ultimately build another detail on top of it. That's kind of a good way to layer your pieces. And so we've fed that wire through, attached it to the back, and now we're building the innermost spiral, and that's going to just form right that way, and that wire is going to fold underneath the stone, the Ethiopian opal that we've just put in there, and that's going to tuck through and go to the back of that in that little corner, if you can see that on the bottom right of the opal. I don't always plan out where the wires are going to feed through. Usually as I'm building the piece, I just notice little spots and I'm like, a wire will fit through there, we're going to feed it through there, and I just prefer the feed through points to be as close as to where the detailing ends. You don't want like extra wire that you're dealing with on the back or on the front, and so you want it to be all as tight as possible. Once you've formed your weaves or your spiral, you're ready to add the 30 gauge round and start your spiral weave details. Again, we're doing a progression of 2 to 3 to 4 to 5 to 6 on the outermost spiral, and then the innermost we will continue only wrapping twice around that wire. We're going to build up that spiral weave detail until it's at the Ethiopian opal, making sure to keep everything tight. I have a couple of my points there that I could have kept tighter now that I'm looking at this again. So always try to keep your 30 gauge tight, especially when you're doing these weaves, so that way the connection points all look nice and flush. Zooming back out, we're going to clip off the extra length of our innermost spiral, and we are going to feed that through to the back underneath that opal and connect it to the back. Feeding that wire through to the back, just inching it back there, and then also pulling it on the back, but not pulling it too hard so I don't mess up this spiral weave detail that we just built. I also don't want to pull it back too quick to, break the wire or anything like that. And so now I'm going to continue with the 30 gauge along the two lengths of 21 gauge square that run along the left side of that opal. I'm going to wrap them together with just like a simple X pattern and just wrapping it mostly on the outermost 21 gauge square and keeping the innermost one that we connect together, keeping that kind of flush and open against that opal. Then once all three of these wires come together near the top of the opal, I'm going to start another little fanned X-weave pattern, and this is going to connect all three of these wires together while creating a little triangle X-weave, fan thing that's right there. I don't really know what to call it, but it's kind of like a spiral weave detail, but reverse. We're starting off with the most amount, so I was doing 4 connections on the first connection, 4 connections on the beginning of the triangle, and then going over to the wire that was left over from the text side style that we had done earlier. I was going twice around that, and then 3 times over on the longer side, and then twice over on the text side style, and then 2 times over, basically a reverse progression on this little triangle detail that's up here near the top of the opal. Depending on what size stone you have, it might look different from what I've done here, but I just had this little triangle, and so I did a reverse fan opening to connect that all together and to cover that space. And so now what I'm doing is utilizing the 30 gauge to connect all of the 21 gauge square on the back. This is going to feed to the back and make connections onto the frame, and this 30 gauge is also going to continue running up the length of the swirled 21 gauge square that runs along this 13 gauge half round wire. So I'm going to continue connecting these 3 wires together. The wire that is bent straight back is the wire that was left over from the textile patterning. I'm also going to bend back one of the wires from the spiral weave details. It really doesn't matter which one you do. I'm doing the innermost one, and then the outermost wire that runs along the 13 gauge half round. I will continue to run that along up that entire length of the 13 gauge half round. I've now connected them using some X-weave patterns, and I'm finishing off that 30 gauge on that length of 21 gauge square that shoots straight back, just wrapping it all the way around it until it's far enough down the length of wire that I can make a connection point with that wire, and it'll ultimately wrap the 30 gauge under the connection point and fasten that down as well. Pulling out my little points of 30G that I need to tie off, kind of cleaning everything up, making some final adjustments on our spiral weaves. This is where we're going to be tying everything together and bringing these detailings to a finish. And so once you've connected all of your points on the back, you've clipped off your excess and made your connections, I'm going to take another length of 22 gauge round. You don't have to do this part, but I thought it would just be a nice little addition. I'm going to connect it to my frame, and then I am going to utilize that to build another little spiral inside our original spiral weave detail. This is just going to be like an innermost line that will help kind of highlight that spiral detail right there. And so I'm going to send back my extra through an opening to the back of the frame. Again, inching that back there using my thumb to keep the shape of the swirl, and then pulling that length of wire back to the back so we can make our connection to the frame. making some minute adjustments there, pulling it through, and that looks pretty good so far. Just want to straighten everything up a little bit, push it down in there a bit more. And I think that adds just a nice little addition of a line, you know, kind of exaggerating that innermost swirl a little bit. And so one thing I also like to do is to take a chopstick and push on the stone and just make sure it's not going to go anywhere. That opal is definitely not going anywhere. I recommend a chopstick just because it's wood and it won't scratch the stone, whereas like, you know, if you take your pliers and push on the opal, you might break it, might scratch it. So just straightening up my two most wires at the top. We've got a length of 13 gauge half round and a length of 21 gauge square left over from the spiral weave details. These will ultimately get bent back and connected to the frame, and then there's also going to be the final polish and oxidization, but I'm going to be showing you guys the back plating process first, and then I'm also going to be building and attaching a dangle bail at the top of this piece. That's going to be kind of a bit of a larger dangle bail. It's not going to be one of the smaller ones that we normally do, and so yeah, I will show you guys that whole process in the next video, next couple of tutorials. There's like maybe 2 or 3 more parts on this. Sorry it's taking so long. These complex pendants, there's just no easy way to go about it. There's just a lot of different parts to them, and yeah, the construction is very strenuous. A lot of these pieces take me, you know, a couple of days to finish and stuff. So thank you all so much. I hope you appreciate this tutorial, and yeah, have a great weekend.